Welcome to the Co-Living Circle podcast. I am the host and founder of Co-Living Circle, Paul Burke, and I have a very special guest, Connor Moore, who is the CEO of Coliving Corner, actually. So it's fate that the circle and the corner collide at some point. Connor, as far as I'm concerned, is the most prolific writer in the co-living space, really diving into a lot of the nuance and a lot of sort of the social aspects of it, but in a sort of a technical way. Connor, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, Paul, thanks so much for having me. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, co-living circle and co-living corner had to meet up at some point. So happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, they definitely did. And so let's first talk about your journey to discovering co-living. The industry's obviously pretty new in its infancy, and there just isn't a ton of people writing about it or you coming at it sort of from like a journalistic standpoint, right? And that's something that you got into a ton on your website, and we'll talk a little bit more about your thesis and some of that stuff. But tell us about your journey to discovering co-living in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of growing up, I've always been, really energized by being around a lot of folks. There's many different communities that I've been a part of that I just really feel most alive when I'm a part of those. And so after my undergrad, I'd say is first when I kind of got introduced into co-living. I did what really amounts to a gap year. I was living abroad in Australia, New Zealand, and in Thailand and working there as well. And so when I was in New Zealand, I was actually living in what I would really call is a long-term hostel now. But I was living with folks from all over the world. And so we were really in a co-living environment. And I kind of asked myself, why can't we live like this always? And so that's kind of how I got into it. And then when I did a bit more research, I was like, oh, this is a thing. It's called co-living. And then the next big step into that came actually last summer. So about this time last year, when during my MBA internship period, the Asia School of Business, where I was attending business school in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, they gave me the chance to do what's called the entrepreneurship track. So they really gave me what amounts to a research grant. And I was able to travel around the world, mostly in the US and in Southeast Asia, and visit co-living places, interview founders, co-live the entire time. And it was really, really awesome to kind of open my eyes to the different executions of co-living, as well as this is the industry that I want to be in post MBA. So that's kind of where we got to today. And then after the summer, I started the blog and really started writing a lot and meeting as many people as I possibly can. So I'm happy that path ended up where I am today.
Yeah. Well, so tell me a little. So co-living is obviously, like we said, it's pretty darn new as far as what modern day co-living is. And so you were studying this in school, and you were just like, "Wow, this is extremely interesting." Did anybody really understand what you were doing or what co-living was? I mean, because probably from the outside perspective, it's like, "Oh, you're studying like hostels," or like
Yep.
what was the reaction you got from people who you told this is what I'm really interested in, this is the industry I want to sort of attach myself to?
Sure. Yeah. So I think with any new industry, you're always going to have that kind of education piece as well. You're like, oh yeah, I'm doing co-living, and they're like, oh, you mean co-working? And it's like, well,
Huh.
yeah, sort of, but no, not really at all. And so there's certainly that piece of explaining it to folks. But the cool thing is that whenever I would explain it to, especially a lot of people that I graduated college with or went to high school with that have now, lived in cities across the U.S. or across the world, for 5 or 6 years at a minimum, they're kind of like, wow, this is actually a great idea. So I can, live in cities, like live with a bunch of people that also want to be friends with me. Like they kind of see it almost as a continuation of the, kind of friendliness and community driven nature of college living as well. Right. So it really makes sense to a lot of people once I explain it to them, but typically it takes about 3 or 5 minutes. You're exactly right to kind of say, hey, this is exactly what I'm trying to do. And then people kind of warm up to the idea.
Right. Um, and so for you, when you were living in all these co-living spaces across Asia, what do you think really attracted to you, like at your core of that experience? What were you like, okay, this is what I like, I love this and I want to pursue this?
Yeah, sure. So I think when it comes down to it, like getting a bunch of people from a lot of different backgrounds and kind of having them all in the same space and time at once, I think there's something amazing that can happen from that. Obviously, it doesn't happen every time, but I think if you have the right place and you have the right kind of programming and the kind of intentionality of the people that are there, I think it can really create an experience that later on, when everyone kind of, years down the line, they look back and they're like, wow, what a time we had there. They kind of miss that environment, and they still keep up with a lot of those people. Everyone's kind of had those experiences before, whether it's a college organization or a high school sports team or whatever it might be. And I think that if done correctly, we can bring that exact same kind of feeling and that same environment to living. And I think that in the 21st century thus far, I don't think that we've created that quite yet. I think most adults kind of live in an environment, for better or for worse, where they're not having that type of connection to their living environment. And so I think when I was living in a lot of these co-living places and I could see that firsthand, I was like, let's get on this train. I would love to, kind of be surrounded by this in my working career, as well as try to create this for as many people across the world as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a good segue to talk about what co-living will look like after the pandemic. Because like you said, I mean, right now people are, if you live in a studio or one bedroom or you're living by yourself, whatever it is, it's got to be lonely. I mean, maybe month 1 you're okay, but once you hit month 2, 3, 4, you're like, man, I just want someone to hang out with, to play board games with, just shoot the shit. And everyone is sick of Zoom and FaceTime and all. We just want human connection. And so I think, but there's still sort of the social distancing and not mixing germs with people. So, it's going to be interesting what co-living looks like and sort of the reaction to it following the pandemic. What do you think it will look like, if there will be any changes or any revelations from what we're going through right now?
Sure. Yeah. So I definitely think there will be some changes, and I think that question has really been the buzz of the co-living industry. I guess, well, really every industry, I suppose,
Yeah.
for the past 4 or 5 months. But yeah. So I've actually written a few pieces. One was actually titled "Why Co-living is the Ideal Living Solution During a Pandemic," and I think it, of course, sounds counterintuitive because you have this co-living product that's saying we're going to create face-to-face interactions and kind of the anti-social distancing, right? However, I think there's a lot of other facets to living during a pandemic. One that you just mentioned, Paul, that was looking at if I'm living in a studio apartment in Manhattan, I don't get to see a lot of folks every day, which that starts to have obviously kind of mental health as well as physical health kind of effects, right? As far as, like, humans are very social creatures, and they do need that kind of social interaction, right? And then as well, one of the pieces that just came out that I'm very excited about, I actually collaborated with a few of the guys over at Co-Living Insights, which is a magazine publication. The second edition came out, I think it was last week, but got to work with Matt Lesniak and Guy Perdrix, and they're co-living titans for sure. But we kind of tackled the question as far as, how is co-living going to change? Is it here to stay? I think when talking with a lot of folks in the industry, the resounding response is co-living is certainly here to stay, but it will change. A lot of the co-living right now, I think one of the ways it's going to change is some co-living is short-term, some of it is long-term, right? And so a lot of the shorter-term stays are more like hostels, hotels, Airbnb. Obviously, with international travel restrictions and all of that, those guys are getting hit pretty hard. So some of those may or may not be around post-pandemic whenever we come out the other side of this. But I think a lot of the longer-term co-living places, at least from the numbers that have been released thus far, actually are faring better than the traditional apartment and multifamily real estate solutions. So as far as occupancy rates and retention rates and all that kind of stuff. So it has been good to see the resiliency of co-living thus far. I think and maybe we can get into this a bit later, but I think maybe some of the spatial design models might change. The terms of the lease, as far as being more flexible, might change. But thus far, I think co-living is definitely here to stay. And I'm excited to see the growth once we kind of come out the other side of this.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. The more long-term co-living spaces, Star City, for example, their founders tweeted out, "Hey, we're collecting rents 96%." So they're doing just fine, and like you said, they're actually capitalizing on this actually. And then I guess I have a article here pulled up by the Rolling Stone. Co-living is all about community in close quarters, all of which is antithetical to social distancing. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No, that sounds exactly right, though. Yep.
Yeah, it really is. So, and I think that's where sort of it gets really interesting in that not all co-living is the same. It's under the same umbrella, but that's where you have differences between, and I think going forward, we're going to see so many different kinds of communities. And you wrote a really interesting article about community versus scalability. And this is something I've sort of been thinking about, like as soon as I got into the industry, how you have places that have more of a broad mission, who really, I guess the word they would just use is intentional living. Not 100% sure what that means. I guess you care about your neighbors and all that. And then there's, more community based, which is maybe designed around a special interest or passion. One comes to mind is Upstart Co-living in Los Angeles that caters to artists, musicians, dancers, creatives. What's your sort of thought about the community versus scalability debate? Because especially as companies like Star City are killing it, we're going to see maybe some companies stray more towards the scalability aspect.
Right. No, I'm very glad you brought this up, Paul. It's something that I find absolutely fascinating, and I think kind of talking with a lot of experts in the industry over the past year, it's really been something that is fairly at the forefront, I would say, probably of a lot of kind of executive teams as far as, okay, what kind of size co-living place do we want to have? How many units? How does that affect the operations? How does that affect the community? And I think really a lot of it kind of comes down to common sense, right? So if you have a house in LA that has 10 people there, right? You can be very good friends with the other 9 people in that house, right? Star City that you mentioned, they actually have what's going to be the largest co-living building in the world in San Jose. It's going to be over 800 beds, right?
Wow.
No matter what you do, you cannot know the names of the other 799 people there, right? So the way that those communities function as far as creating the community is going to be very different. If you have 10 bedrooms, you can have a pizza night every Friday. You can have, all kinds of events, and literally everybody can attend. Also bring their 2 or 3 closest friends, right? And you still have a manageable kind of size of the community. When we're talking about 800 people, that's when you reach scalability, right? So it's when each of those, like kind of looking at the unit economics and looking at the kind of economic, like economies of scale, you can see that you start to actually make more profit per resident or per room. And so when you look at that, it's like, oh, well, we don't want to just be profit driven. But at the end of the day, if you're making more profit, you can then reinvest that profit and create more properties, right? So there's certainly not one right answer. Community is great, but scalability is extremely important. If we want, if people in the co-living industry want this to be as big as it can be and have a massive positive impact on the way people live in the 21st century, you need to have scalability. But you need to have it without losing the community. So I think one of the theories that's kind of been put forward, I did not create it, but
It's okay. You can take credit for it, Connor.
Okay. All right, fair. No, but there's been a lot of people that have obviously been thinking about this in the industry, and they've come up with what's called the cluster model. And basically, the idea is if we take that community that we had at that 10-person house, and we kind of break up our larger, 100 or 800 communities into these smaller, maybe 10 person groups, you can kind of create that smaller community, that familiarity that people need with their closest friends, and kind of copy it over to a bigger building. Without boring the audience too much, one of the researchers that I found extremely interesting is Robin Dunbar. And you may have heard of Dunbar's number, which is 150, which is like the maximum amount of human connections that a person can have at once. But he also kind of goes into that we have these kind of layers. The closest layer is around 5 people. It's your closest family and friends. The next layer is around 15. It's maybe some of your coworkers or acquaintances, and then 50, and then out to 150. And so his kind of theory is that this is human psychology. This is how the human brain works. And so I think if we can kind of map those psychological theories to co-living locations, so basically create, maybe there's a unit that has 5 people. Then you have a cluster of 3 units that has 15 people. Then you have a bigger cluster that has 50, and then you kind of can expand from there, right? So if we're able to create these clusters and these kind of different layers of familiarity and social layers for co-living residents, I think we'll be able to create both community and scalability. And it hasn't totally been done yet, which is also super exciting in the co-living industry. All these companies are trying different models, and we'll see which one works best. But at a theory level, at least, when I'm at my computer writing about it, it sounds great. We'll see how it works in practice.
Yeah, and I want to pick up right where you left off on that in a minute, because we sort of talked about how architectural design can help cultivate maybe these clusters or these communities, especially these large-scale co-living spaces with 800 bedrooms where, like you said, you're not going to know 750 of the people, maybe at least, right? What's a number? And just to share one of my experiences, I went to co-living space in LA called Treehouse and had dinner with one of my friends who lived there. And it was about maybe 40 to 60 people at the time. And it seemed like she knew basically everybody in this space. And I thought, okay, I wonder if that's the convergence of community and scalability. What number would you say, does it start? Is it 50? Like, that to me sounds like the right number, but I'm not sure.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I've actually heard 50 a few times as well. So I was on Coliv, which is the kind of international co-living organization that I'm a part of. There was a call, I think it was in Australia, and one of the CEOs there, I think it was Reese Williams, who started UKO, co-living down there. And he mentioned that their kind of sweet spot that they found right now is around 50. And so he's kind of saying exactly like you said, kind of that balance between, you can't have 2 people in a house and hope for it to be profitable, right? But if you have 50, you can still have that familiarity. You can still have that kind of close-knit group. And maybe you're not best friends with all 50, but you at least know their names, right? And then as well, you can also get some of the advantages of the scalability and the economies of scale. So I'm not sure what the total magic number is, but 50 or maybe around 40 to 60 is certainly one that's kind of been thrown around thus far.
Yeah, sure. And let's talk about sort of, and this is way beyond my IQ level and pay grade, but luckily this is something that you've been studying. So for a company like Star City or maybe a Common that has a ton of bedrooms, I mean, maybe the criticism there is you get all the scalability with very little community, just because, I mean, that's so hard to facilitate when you have that many people, right? How does architectural design play a role in cultivating relationships? You talked about clusters a little bit, but why don't you go into that so you can help me understand how this all works?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think kind of big picture, when we look at spatial design for living solutions, right? We've seen a ton of innovation, not in the living design, but in office design, right? So if you think about, these huge offices in Silicon Valley, I'm thinking of the Apple, basically spaceship, big circle thing. SpaceX is one of my favorite companies. They have, I think, like a bunch of glass walls to kind of, and no doors or something like that, because It will stop communication. So there's a lot of, and then AirAsia was another one that when I was in Kuala Lumpur, we got to visit their headquarters, and they have an amazing, amazing place. They actually have a slide that goes from the fourth floor all the way down to the first floor to where the cafeteria is. So there's been all of these like crazy innovation and
That's
development
crazy.
as far as office spaces, but we haven't seen hardly any innovation as far as where we live. Which, when you think about it, that's kind of crazy. Sure, we spend a lot of time at the office, but we spend a ton of time at home, right? And so, if we can design our office better to better achieve our business goals, we can certainly design our living spaces better to achieve our living goals, right? And so, I think there's been a lot of people that are, like you said, it's certainly above my pay grade as well. But I've been able to speak with a bunch of architectural experts that are kind of saying, okay, the way we live has changed so drastically in the 21st century. Let's start to design our spaces to better fit our lifestyles. And so a few of those people that I've spoken with, one was David Chun, who runs a co-living place out in California called Co-House in Los Angeles. And his whole idea is we should start reversing the order or changing the order of a typical living household, right? So typically you have an entrance, a doorway, then it goes to a common room area, then there's the passageway, then it goes to the bedrooms, right? So think about probably the house that you're in right now. The door goes to a hallway straight to the living room or kitchen or whatever it is. And then you kind of have these hallways that go to the bedrooms, right? Well, his idea is that this doesn't really create some of the privacy that you might want if you're living in a shared house, right? If it's just your family or whatever, that's fine. But if you're living with 10 kind of strangers, maybe you just want to go straight to your bedroom, right? And then hang out when it's time to hang out. So his idea is to kind of take that order and say, let's do entrance, then passageway, then that passageway will connect to the common rooms and to the bedroom. So in that way, it kind of creates the privacy that you need when you're living in a shared living quarters, but as well, when you want to hang out and when you want to go to those common areas, you have the access, right? Another one of the architects that I spoke with is Natasha Reed, and she's actually out of London, and she has her own kind of think tank kind of design lab called Matter Space Soul. And some of the frameworks they're using are fascinating. One of them is called the Well Building Standard. It's a fairly well-known kind of architectural design standard that's saying, let's have more fresh air in our buildings. Let's have more natural light. Let's have more, kind of greenery and vegetation, right? And so all of this is kind of looking at how can we create, kind of architectural design, and how can we use architectural design to create a sense of belonging, kind of community, but then as well focus on well-being. So I think, and until I spoke with these people, I had never even thought about that. I had never even said, oh, let's, create, the spatial layout of this place in order to increase well-being. But there's people out there that are doing it right now, and it's all been really kind of fascinating to see how that's going to evolve. And I think one of the kind of barriers in co-living thus far is the kind of the risk appetite for the investors. So a lot of folks right now are kind of saying, hey, this co-living thing is kind of coming up, but we're not totally sold on it yet. And a lot of these investors are very risk adverse. So what they're thinking is, okay, if for some reason or another, these co-living operators go belly up, how much will it cost to convert this, 30-story apartment building back to traditional multifamily? And so
Right.
a lot of the layouts right now have been similar to kind of what I would call the old guard of spatial design, right? So it's your typical long hallway apartments, and the layout is fairly similar. But I think once co-living really starts to be, kind of defined as its own asset class, I think a lot of these real estate investors will say, okay, you know what, we're willing to design this building a bit differently because we have confidence in co-living moving forward. And that's when I think we can really get this, all the creators and innovators and all these architects out there can really have kind of free reign and create spaces that will really bring us together as people, as a community, and then as well, hopefully improve our well-being.
That's fascinating. And I am glad there's people working on that, because I would never have thought of that. I mean, even I was staying in a hostel a little bit, living in San Francisco, and like you said, there's already sort of a lack of privacy. I mean, that's not really one of the core tenets of co-living. And so, to get to the room, obviously you have to walk through the common area.
Right.
If you've had a long day of work and you're sort of introverted like I am, usually you're not want hey, how's it going? Hey, how's it going? Usually I just want to like set my stuff down, change out of my work stuff, and like relax for a little bit
Exactly.
and then go out. But so I think that's fascinating. Now, do they already have their setup like that, co-house?
They do. They do. Yes, I think they have around 4 or 5 locations currently in Los Angeles. You can check out their website. And David, the founder, is an awesome guy, and he's willing to chat with all kinds of people in the co-living place. But I haven't actually visited those locations. I'm hoping to get out to California here soon because I would love to check out all the operators out there that I didn't get the chance to see this past summer. But yes, they do have, I think, 4 or 5 of their properties. They will have the house. They'll do a bit of an interior redesign rather, and then a lot of theirs are set up in that way where it's entrance, passageway, and then common room and bedroom.
Right. I think that'll be definitely an interesting development, as you said, with companies like Star City and Common both really being successful, that we'll see investors not be so scared to do something radically different from the norm and really retrofit it to be only for co-living with no backup plan, no multifamily, no hotel, just like we're going all in on co-living. And I mean, both you and I being in the industry see that really this is a good time to get into it. One other thing I want to talk about is, so we talked a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting co-living. The current environment politically, I think, is also comes to mind as far as there's a lot of different opinions regarding what's going on, and I want to get your take on that. What what do you think? How is that affecting it? Because it's a big question.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think kind of coming from a public policy background, I love this stuff. I absolutely love, kind of seeing how living trends or, whether it's political trends or societal trends, because obviously, you look back in our country and then when you expand to the world, wow, there's so much diversity. But I think when you look back specifically at the US's history, we go through these cycles of political polarization and then everyone kind of comes together and then we go the other way, right? And so I think right now, for a variety of reasons, we're seeing a lot of political polarization. And this past summer, I actually had the chance to read a few books that are fascinating reads if anyone is actually interested in this. A few of those books, so one of them is called Vanishing Neighbor. It's by Mark Dunkelman out of Brown University. One is called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. And one of the last ones is probably the most popular. It's called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And these books are basically commenting on how the social fabric of our society has changed over the past 40 to 50 years. And so I actually wrote my kind of thesis on this. You can find it on Coliving Corner. It's called The Case for Co-Living, but it's kind of a 5-part series that goes over, all of the changes of how we live and where we live. And a lot of these theories that these sociologists are putting out there as far as we live so differently in the year 2020 than we did really from the year 2000, definitely from the year 1980, right? But our society hasn't really caught up to a lot of these changes. And so the argument that they're kind of making is that where we live and how we live has actually made us more politically polarized. And so what that's kind of looking at, one of the examples that they use is kind of market segmentation. So if we think about a city in the year 1950, there was probably a downtown area. People were starting to move out to the suburbs, but there was probably 1 or 2 main grocery store brands, right? And everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic background, went to this grocery store. So maybe you'd bump into folks, right? But nowadays, if we think about what's happened in the grocery store industry, now in any kind of city across the US, you'll have your Whole Foods. And when Whole Foods moves into there, and I'm an apartment developer, what kind of apartment product am I going to put close to that Whole Foods? Affordable housing or luxury housing? Probably I'm going to go for the luxury apartments, right? So then, and then if I'm a luxury restaurant, if I'm charging, you know, a lot of money, where am I going to go? Well, I'm going to go to that neighborhood, right? Because that's where the people live and all of that. And then on the other side of town, there might be an Aldi, right? Which is more of an affordable grocery store. So then you start to see people move into that neighborhood that would shop there, right? And then so you start to see other things in that neighborhood, right? So basically, this idea is that through market segmentation and through all of this customization of our economies and our cities, we've kind of sorted ourselves into these pockets of kind of neighborhoods, not of clones of ourselves, but almost, right? And so you hear a lot of people that say we exist in these echo chambers, and I think it's totally true, right? And it's at no fault of our own. Like if I'm going to move into a neighborhood, you know, and it's more people that like have a background like myself, I see somebody wearing a Duke basketball hat or whatever, like I'll go talk to them, right? Because we share some kind of background, right? But if you look at how that kind of affects society as a whole, you end up talking to people just like yourself, whether it's religiously, like educationally, politically. And so it kind of changes the way that you start to think about things. And so you're not having a lot of these discussions kind of across the aisle, if you will,
Right.
that you may have had in another time, right? And so I think it was pretty fascinating to kind of connect how we live and where we live with maybe some of the, you know, kind of political polarization or other kind of societal problems that we have today. And so I think to kind of bring all of that back to co-living, we kind of dove down a rabbit hole there. I think co-living, if executed correctly, can bring people from a lot of these different backgrounds and a lot of different, you know, kind of socioeconomic statuses, hopefully, to where you can start to have these conversations again. You can start to say, hey, this person might not agree with me on the way our economy is being run or the way that we're doing this kind of policy thing. However, you know, they're a great friend to have around the co-living space. And so I think it can basically, to kind of sum it up, it can kind of restore the neighborliness, I guess, of the U.S., right? To kind of have those connections that, for one reason or another, maybe we don't have as much anymore. So, but it all comes back to executing co-living correctly. So if we just have these co-living places that are just, you know, only young professionals that graduated from college and only went to this, you know, kind of jobs in that city, then we're exacerbating the problem, right? But if we can think about it intentionally and say, how can we get people in this co-living unit from a variety of different backgrounds? I think co-living can be a big part of the solution to start to kind of challenge a lot of the societal problems that have risen up over the past few decades.
Yeah, I think first of all that was a fantastic high level overview of what's going on. Um, yeah, I mean there's so much division and sort of like you said, echo chambers, whether it be online or among friend groups, um, and whether it be the left or the right, it's people a lot of confirmation bias and seeking
Mm-hmm.
the information you want to hear and having you know conversations with people who mostly agree with you if you can, knowing if you have a conversation with someone on that end of the aisle, I mean it's hard to have a conversation on for either side right now. um so yeah, I think that co-living can and should help really shape that and allow those conversations to happen naturally. And like you said, I think diversity is a big part of it. When I went to Treehouse, I was amazed at how many people from different backgrounds, different colors, different religions, like, and that's one of the nice things about it is you have people, at least in a lot of co-living spaces, who are traveling as well.
Right.
That's probably more short term, but um, there's another number I was told where I think 73% of people who lived in a certain co-living brand were not from where they were living.
Hmm.
So when you have people coming from different places, that also leads to a diversity of background, diversity of thought, stuff like that. So that yeah, that was an awesome explanation, Connor. I feel like there was one more thing at least I wanted to talk to you about. Um, Oh yeah, I have it. I have it. And this sort of goes back to the community versus scalability thing. Um, I'm really fascinated with sort of niche co-living spaces, and I think there's a huge potential there to really bring people together around a singular cause, whether that be arts or sports or business or There's a lot of different, even the outdoors and stuff like that. What do you think of sort of how niche we can get into co-living spaces, and how many, like, what do you imagine is possible with that?
Yeah, so right off the bat, I think the sky is the limit. I think, and visiting a lot of what I would call interest-based kind of co-living companies, it really is great. And I think kind of making it more niche can kind of say, you can get exactly who you want in that household, right? I think it's almost a slippery slope in that you want to make sure that it's not just kind of one kind of background of people, kind of like what we were just talking about. But of course, there's a few like entrepreneurship kind of based co-living where it's a bunch of founders or people that are in the kind of startup space, and obviously they come from a huge variety of backgrounds, right? So and then I saw one in San Diego called Living Q, that has, I think they have like around 30 people, but they're all creators of some kind. So one I think owns her own bakery. There's a few different musicians. And so it's kind of like we're all creators, we're all kind of artists, right? And I think with, the kind of cliche kind of term, people are trying to find their tribe, if you will. I think a lot of these niche co-living places can say, hey, you want to live with a bunch of creatives because that's the people that you vibe with? Fantastic. We've created the exact solution for you. You want to live in a startup environment where you guys are all working remotely and going crazy and, really grinding a lot? Like, great, we have that for you. And I think that even in a lot of these bigger co-living places, kind of going back to the clustering model, kind of, you can maybe even start to have, and I don't want to go too Harry Potter here, but you can almost sort your kind of larger building into kind of houses, if you will, right? So
Yeah.
let's say that you have 100 people. You could have 25 that are, and you could also use spatial design to kind of tie everything that we've talked about in this call. You could use spatial design to kind of create a quarter of that building. Maybe it's a floor, for example, that would all be into the outdoors. Then the second floor, they would all be into startups or whatever it might be, right? So I think you can even create that interest-based co-living and that kind of niche kind of co-living idea within these larger buildings, right? So, and I think when it comes down to it, people want to live with and people want to interact with people that are at least share values or share some kind of interest, right? So I think we'll see where it all goes, whether it's just these little kind of boutique kind of niche co-living operators popping up, but I think as well you can start to have these kind of groups within the larger co-living operators that kind of hit on that same idea that people enjoy spending time with others that have shared interests.
Right. And I think that is such a massive opportunity there to bring interest-based housing to people. And I like the idea of, having a Dumbledore team. I just watched Harry Potter. I'm not doing a good job. But anyway, basically teams almost within a large property that do make it sort of bring the community aspect to something that's already been scaled out. Connor, that's all the topics I have. You crushed it, man. Do you have anything you want to talk about?
I mean, I think that's, yeah, we obviously got to cover a huge spectrum today. I
Did.
love kind of discussions talking about, a lot of the kind of big picture topics in the industry right now. But yeah, if anybody, I mean, I've absolutely loved chatting with people from all over the world that are interested in co-living. So please reach out. I'm more than happy to have, any kind of conversation around co-living.
And if it's okay with you, Connor, we'll throw Coliving Corner and then your LinkedIn in the show notes so people can hit you up and yeah, pick your brain because they probably should. All right. Thanks, Connor. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your time today, Paul.